The age of Andrew Jackson has also been called the age of democracy because during this time, American political institutions became much more democratic, small d democratic. First of all, by the time of Andrew Jackson's rise to prominence, almost all states except for South Carolina had extended suffrage to all white males as opposed to only property owning white males before. So all white males 21 years of age and older had the right to vote in most of the states at this time. You also saw a rise in the number of elected public officials, and you had Martin Van Buren and the birth of the first modern political party in the United States, the Democratic Party, big D, Democratic Party. You also saw the popular election of presidential electors for the first time, as opposed to choosing those electors by state legislatures. And you saw increased voter participation between Democrats and the opposition party that rose up to oppose them, the Whigs. That voter participation would peak in the presidential election of 1840. We'll talk about that later. And you have the importance of economic questions during this time period. Remember that the market revolution hangs over everything that happens in the age of Jackson, and so you see an increased importance of economic questions during this time. The presidential election of 1824 is the event that brought the era of good feelings to a crashing end and brought Andrew Jackson to prominence. The election turned into a four-way race between William Crawford of Georgia, Henry Clay of Kentucky, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, and John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, the Secretary of State. In the initial balloting in the election, no one earned a majority of electors in the Electoral College, even though Andrew Jackson won a plurality of both the electors and the popular vote. In early 1825, therefore, in accordance with the 12th Amendment, the U.S. House had to choose the president. Henry Clay decided to withdraw from the contest, but Clay, as a member of the House, did throw his influence behind John Quincy Adams, and with Clay's influence behind him, the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams as the President of the United States. That made John Quincy Adams just the latest in a series of Secretaries of State to win the presidency, starting with Thomas Jefferson. And so the Secretary of State position looks like a jumping off point to the presidency at this point. Well, after Adams won the presidency, he turned around and named Henry Clay his Secretary of State. That led to Andrew Jackson to claim that the election was rigged, that there was a corrupt bargain, in Jackson's words, between Adams and Clay to throw the election for Adams so that Clay could then become Secretary of State and President. And so this cry of corrupt bargain would actually ruin the presidency of John Quincy Adams and tarnish the reputation of Henry Clay, such that Clay, although he would try for the presidency multiple times after this, never actually won the presidency. And immediately Andrew Jackson began campaigning for 1828. You can see here the Electoral College of 1824, with Jackson earning a plurality but not a majority of electoral votes. Andrew Jackson, after his defeat in 1825, turned his attention to organizing a new political party as a vehicle to help get him elected to the presidency. He allied himself with Martin Van Buren of New York, and Van Buren and Jackson helped to form the Democratic Party, big D Democratic Party. And the Democrats in this election began grassroots political mobilization. By 1828, there was a Jackson for President club in almost every city and town in the country. Grassroots political mobilization is where neighbors tell their neighbors about a candidate. They organize for a candidate, have rallies for a candidate. 1828, though, was arguably the ugliest presidential election until 2016. There was a great deal of mudslinging between both sides. John Quincy Adams, the president, and his allies accused Andrew Jackson of being the son of a slave. The Jackson camp accused Adams of being the son of a prostitute. But ultimately, the charge that struck the most at the Jacksons was the charge that Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife, was a bigamist. And this charge struck at the Jacksons the most because, technically speaking, 30 years earlier, it had been true. Now, Rachel Jackson was born in 1767, the same year as Andrew Jackson, and in Nashville, she was first married to a man named Louis Robards. But in 1791, she eloped with Andrew Jackson. She had separated from Robards. She believed that Robards had gotten them a legal divorce in the state of Kentucky where they had originally been married. But it was later learned that Robards had not obtained a divorce, and that which made the marriage of Rachel to Andrew Jackson illegal and made Rachel Jackson a bigamist. As soon as the Jacksons realized that their union was illegal, they actually did remarry in 1794 after her divorce from Louis Robards had been finalized. But the fact that the Adams camp had drug up this 30-year-old story into the light greatly injured Rachel Jackson emotionally and Andrew Jackson. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson cultivated an image of himself as a man of the people, a commoner. Now, by this time, Jackson may have been born a commoner in the backwoods of South Carolina, but he certainly was not a commoner by this time. He owned a large plantation outside Nashville called the Hermitage, and he was a wealthy man who owned a number of enslaved African Americans and had become wealthy in slaves and cotton. But he cultivated this image, and he started this trend in every presidential candidate since Andrew Jackson in 1828 has tried to portray themselves as a man or woman of the people. So Jackson started this trend. And, of course, the battle cry of the Jackson campaign and of Jackson's supporters was corrupt bargain against John Adams and Henry Clay. And so in the presidential election of 1828, Andrew Jackson won a landslide victory. But there was no silver lining for Andrew Jackson. In December of 1828, as Andrew and Rachel Jackson prepared to move from the Hermitage to Washington, D.C., Rachel Jackson died of a heart attack. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency as a widower. The duties of First Lady were taken over by the niece of Mrs. Jackson and Emily Donaldson. But Andrew Jackson never forgave his opponents, and he blamed Henry Clay and John Adams for the death of his wife. He blamed them for the rest of his life for her death. He said the stress that they had put on her brought about her untimely demise. You can see here the Electoral College of 1828, and Andrew Jackson winning a huge victory over John Quincy Adams. When Jackson was inaugurated on March 4th, 1829, they organized a party at the White House. After all, Andrew Jackson was a man of the people. The White House was the people's house. And so they invited all of the guests that had come from Tennessee, as well as anyone who wanted to from Washington, to attend this party inside the White House, where they served the guests liquor, among other refreshments. Well, the party quickly turned riotous, if you will. The drunken guests destroyed the furniture, tore out the wallpaper. At one point, Andrew Jackson was forced to jump out of a second-story window to avoid the crush of his own admirers. certainly no president has ever had an inaugural gala to match that of Andrew Jackson in 1829. In a bizarre turn, the event that took up most of the time during Andrew Jackson's first term as president was known as the Peggy Eaton Affair, or the Petticoat Affair. It was a national scandal. And in order to understand where this scandal came from, we have to go back to the period directly after the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson was serving as a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. Jackson stayed at a boarding house called Franklin House, along with the other U.S. Senator from Tennessee, John Eaton. And at that time, it was common for politicians to stay in boarding houses when they were in service in Washington, D.C. Politicians did not own their own residences in Washington, but rather they stayed in these boarding houses and took their food in the dining halls of the boarding houses along with the other guests. Well, the man who owned Franklin House was named William O'Neill. William O'Neill had a daughter named Margaret, or Peggy O'Neill. She was born in 1799, so at this time she is a teenager. She was noted for her beauty, vivacity. She was well educated for the time. And Andrew Jackson took a liking to Peggy O'Neill. As an interested person in her upbringing, there's no evidence that Jackson took a romantic interest in her, but it appears that Senator John Eaton did take a romantic interest in Peggy. Well, in 1816, at the age of 17, Margaret O'Neill instead married John Timberlake, a 39-year-old purser in the U.S. Navy, and Margaret and John Timberlake had 2 children. A third died in infancy. In 1828, the year that Andrew Jackson was running for the presidency, John Timberlake died in the service of the U.S. Navy while in the Mediterranean on a 4-year voyage. And at that time, societal conventions required an extended mourning period, but instead, Margaret Timberlake, Peggy Timberlake, married Senator Eaton on January 1st, 1829, just 9 months after Timberlake's death. And Andrew Jackson, who would soon be inaugurated as president, presided over their marriage. So Eaton and Peggy are both close friends and confidants of Andrew Jackson. But when Peggy married Senator Eaton, whom Jackson named as Secretary of War in his cabinet, that set a Washington gossip mills into motion that, why, of course Peggy married Senator Eaton. They had been having an affair behind Timberlake's back. And the rumor started that Timberlake had found out about the affair and killed himself as a result overseas. That was not the truth. Timberlake died of pneumonia. But nevertheless, the gossip was led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of now Vice President John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was a states' rights Democrat who had run with Jackson and won the vice presidency in 1828 with Jackson. And the Peggy Eaton affair, first of all, Jackson began to notice early in his presidency that Mrs. Eaton was being excluded from public gatherings. She was nowhere to be found at any of these social events around Washington. Jackson asked around about this phenomenon, and when he learned that Mrs. Eaton was being boycotted by the other cabinet wives and by Floride Calhoun, Jackson became enraged. Jackson saw in Peggy Eaton shadows of his late wife Rachel. He saw a woman who had been unfairly accused in his mind, and whatever her past, had moved beyond it, and so Jackson went to war on her behalf. This was very much a function of Jackson's personality. Jackson began feuding with his cabinet members and with Vice President Calhoun, trying to get them to get their wives to fall in line and include Mrs. Eaton in their social circle, but nothing worked. Finally, in 1832, as Jackson was seeking a second term, all of Jackson's cabinet members and Vice President Calhoun actually resigned and went home. The only cabinet member who survived the scandal was Secretary of State Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, it turns out, was single at this time. He was a widower, and so he could afford to include Mrs. Eaton in these gatherings and be seen doing so by President Jackson. And so the Peggy Eaton affair split the young Democratic Party into a nationalist wing under Andrew Jackson and a more states' rights wing under John C. Calhoun, and it put Martin Van Buren in the driver's seat to become the next president of the United States, rather than Calhoun, as many observers had predicted. So in this way, this scandal, the Petticoat Affair, or the Peggy Eaton Affair, split the young Democratic Party. Going back to his days of fighting the Creeks and even before, Andrew Jackson had a disdain, if not an outright hatred, for Native Americans. In his State of the Union address in 1829, Andrew Jackson called for the removal of Native American tribes in the Southeast, west of the Mississippi. Such a move had long been contemplated by Southerners who wanted to open up the land that was then occupied by the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes to occupation for cotton plantations and other purposes. And so the Congress passed, and Andrew Jackson signed into law in May of 1830, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which really is an act of systemic genocide against Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans were removed despite the fact that there was a Supreme Court case in 1832. There was a Georgia law which barred any white men from settling in Indian lands in Georgia. And Samuel Worcester, a white missionary, protested this law, was convicted for protesting this law, and appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In their ruling in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall viewed the Native American tribes as distinct nations, and so therefore the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction over the Cherokees. But despite this ruling, Andrew Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court. Jackson was famously quoted, and although no one can find a reference to the quote is probably apocryphal. That is, that even if Jackson didn't say it, it's probably what he meant. He said, quote, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Meaning that Jackson was going to ignore the Supreme Court decision, saying that Georgia had no jurisdiction over the Cherokees. Over the next several years, Native American tribes, one by one, were removed to what was then called Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And finally, in 1838, during Martin Van Buren's term as president, Martin Van Buren ordered the U.S. Army to round up the last of the Cherokees who refused to move and force them to march to Indian Territory. This was known as the Trail of Tears. They were forced to march in the dead of winter, and anywhere from a third to a half of the Cherokees who made this trip died along the way. You can see wagon ruts there from the Trail of Tears on the bottom left-hand side, and an artist's rendition of the Trail of Tears on the right. Jackson's treatment of Native Americans, his signing of the Indian Removal Act, certainly mark a low point of Jackson's presidency at best, and outright genocide at worst. You can see here a map of lands occupied by various tribes: the Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Seminoles. the dates at which the bulk of those tribes were removed to Indian Territory, and the new territories that they occupied in what is now Oklahoma, the routes that they took. Another major issue that occurred during the presidency of Andrew Jackson was called the Nullification Crisis. But in order to understand how we got to this crisis, we must understand the history of South Carolina to this point. After the Panic of 1819, the South Carolina economy had gone downhill rapidly. The price of cotton dropped dramatically, and this set enslavers in South Carolina on edge about their economic prospects. At heart, the Nullification Crisis is really about slavery and the profitability and long-term viability of slavery. On the surface, it's about tariffs, which we'll talk about in a moment, but really it's about slavery. Meanwhile, in 1822, you had the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in Charleston. Denmark-Vesey was born in the Caribbean as an enslaved man. He was in his early 60s in 1822. As a young man, he had belonged to a ship's captain. He had witnessed for himself the Haitian Revolution firsthand. He was literate. He had read about the debates in the Missouri Compromise in the newspapers there in Charleston. And Denmark-Vesey was very discontented with his lot in life. First of all, let's back up. Denmark-Vesey by 1822 is actually a free man living in Charleston. In 1800, he actually bought tickets to a street lottery in Charleston and won the lottery, $600, and with that money purchased his freedom. He also helped to found the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the oldest AME church in the South to this day. So Denmark-Vesey was a pillar of his community in Charleston. Vesey in 1820 had become very disenchanted, though. He was angry. He had a wife and children that he could not afford to purchase their freedom. And so Vesey began planning a Haitian-style revolt in and around the Charleston area. And for 2 years, he and his co-conspirators planned, plotted, hoarded ammunition, muskets. And finally, in the summer of 1822, as the rebellion was about to occur, one of the co-conspirators got cold feet and informed on the others. At first, the plot was so big that the officials in Charleston were loath to believe the charges, but they came to believe the defector, and within hours, armed groups of men were riding through the streets of Charleston, arresting Denmark-Vesey and his co-conspirators. Denmark-Vesey was hanged in the summer of 1822 in Charleston, but the very possibility of a plot like Denmark-Vesey's plot put white Southerners in South Carolina even more on edge about slavery and the control they had over enslaved African Americans, as well as free people of color living in their community. Meanwhile, in 1831 in Virginia, in Southampton County, Virginia, you'll also have the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved man who lived in Southampton County, Virginia. He was a preacher, and Turner was used by enslavers to preach that slavery was right and that they should obey their owners. Nat Turner grew very tired of preaching this doctrine, and in 1831 he saw a partial solar eclipse, which he took as a sign from God that now was the time to launch a rebellion. In August of 1831, Nat Turner rose up along with others in the community, and they actually managed to carry off the most successful and bloodiest slave rebellion in the history of the American South. The rebellion was eventually put down. Nat Turner was eventually captured and hanged, but the Nat Turner Rebellion was so cataclysmic that the Virginia legislature even held debates about whether or not to abolish slavery after that point. Now, they decided not to, but still, the fact they're debating it shows the effect that Nat Turner had on the psyche of the white South. Meanwhile, that same year, 1831, white abolitionists in the North began publishing an abolitionist newspaper for the first time. We're going to talk more about those social reform movements later. And all of these events combined pushed South Carolinians over the edge into nullification in 1832, which we're going to talk about. You can see here on the bottom left the capture of Nat Turner, and on the upper right, Denmark Vesey and some of his co-conspirators. In 1828, under President John Quincy Adams, the Congress passed and Adams signed into law a 50% protective tariff. South Carolinians soon began calling it the Tariff of Abominations in a dramatic fashion. Meanwhile, John C. Calhoun's relationship with President Andrew Jackson grew more and more tenuous over the issue of this tariff, but also which Jackson supported and Calhoun opposed, but of course also over the Peggy Eaton affair. Finally, in 1830, their differences broke into the open at the annual Jefferson Day dinner toasts, in which Jackson and Calhoun openly argued with each other. Remember that Calhoun resigned the vice presidency. He went back to his Fort Hill plantation, where Clemson University stands today, and he began planning this idea of nullification. The idea goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. It goes back to the idea that if a state decides a federal law is unconstitutional, the state can declare this law unconstitutional and refuse to enforce it. Well, by 1832, when Calhoun begins leading this movement for nullifying the tariff in South Carolina, South Carolinians are finally sufficiently alarmed about the future of slavery between Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and the abolitionists that they are willing to go out on this limb and oppose Andrew Jackson and the tariff. Well, in 1832, the Nullification Convention in South Carolina met and voted to nullify the tariff, that is, not to enforce the tariff. And at this point, South Carolina is now in open revolt against the United States. In 1833, Andrew Jackson took two approaches to this problem. First, they passed a compromise tariff at a lower rate. And when South Carolina refused to accept the compromise tariff, the Congress passed a second compromise tariff and a force bill. The force bill authorized President Andrew Jackson to take U.S. troops into South Carolina and enforce compliance with the tariff if necessary. Calhoun in South Carolina had hoped that other southern states would back them up in this nullification venture, but they did not. And so they find themselves on a limb against Andrew Jackson, who at that time was threatening to go down to South Carolina and hang every traitor from the nearest tree, starting with John C. Calhoun. And so, with no other choice, South Carolina backed down. In 1833, they accepted the second compromise tariff, but the Nullification Convention nullified the force bill just for good measure. The Nullification Convention and the Nullification Crisis is an important milestone on the road to civil war because it transitioned South Carolina from a qualified nationalism to a qualified sectionalism. That is, before the Nullification Crisis, South Carolinians are willing to say we are Americans first and Southerners and slaveholders second. And after the Nullification Crisis, they are saying we are Southerners and slaveholders first and Americans second. That is, if you threaten slavery again, which they view the tariff as threatening slavery because it threatens the profitability of slavery, they said if you threaten slavery again, we will in fact rebel against the United States. And that was important because 27 years later, in 1860, South Carolina would in fact become the first southern state to secede and the next year initiate the American Civil War. The Nullification Crisis is clearly the high point of Jackson's presidency. He upheld the Constitution, and he stared down the nullifiers. He stared down Calhoun and those that would overthrow the Constitution. You can see here three of the men at the center of these pivotal events in Jackson's first term as president. On the lower left, John C. Calhoun. On the right, Andrew Jackson. And in the middle, Martin Van Buren, Secretary of State, who would become president after Andrew Jackson.